It's another great day to talk about what happens inside the boardroom. Welcome to BoardVision, the official podcast of the NACD, the National Association of Corporate Directors. On this show, we share perspectives from leading corporate directors, discuss what makes boards effective, how they can help companies face challenges today, and become future ready. In this episode, Rita Alderman, NACD Associate Director of ESG Content, discusses sustainability, climate risk oversight, the energy transition, COP28, and more, with Karina Litvack, a director on the board of Terna. She is also the former founding chair of the Climate Governance Initiative, launched in collaboration with the World Economic Forum. What is the board's role in overseeing climate-related risk and opportunity? And how can directors enact change? But first, here's a word from our partner.
Want to dive deeper into the boardroom hot topics referenced in NACD's annual report? Register today for Deloitte's Board Governance webinars hosted by Deloitte's Center for Board Effectiveness. This quarterly series provides board members and executives from across industries and geographies with the opportunity to connect and hear insights on topics prevalent on many board agendas today. Learn more and register at deloitte.com/us/boardwebinars.
Hi, I'm Rita Alderman, the Associate Director of ESG Content at NACD, and I'm thrilled to be here with Karina Litvack, who has been a great mentor to many of us in the climate governance space. Karina, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Rita, for having me, and it's really a delight to be here.
So when it comes to climate change, we know the clock is ticking. We also know that businesses cannot succeed in societies that fail. So companies do need to be a part of the solution. And investors, clients, the community at large will be watching to see how businesses do their part. Karina, you have been at the forefront of these climate governance issues for the last 10 years as a board member, and actually even longer than that when you were dealing with the broader climate issues from the investment side of things. So let me start by asking you, who is Karina Litvack? I know you have a passion for ESG issues, both personally and professionally. So please tell us a little bit about what drew you to ESG, climate, and sustainability issues more generally.
Oh, well, thank you for that question, Rita. Look, you're right. The last 10 years, which have been the period when I began to serve on listed company boards, because prior to that, I had been on a variety of boards that were not listed corporates. I have been thrust into this world really in the front seat because I joined the board of an oil and gas major, and you can't be in the oil and gas business and not confront the issue of climate change. And not only that, because I had behind me 25 years in the finance sector focusing on sustainable finance and climate change being one of the key areas of focus for me, I thought, well, if anyone is going to be in a position to address this issue, it really ought to be me. But in actual fact, I found that I really lacked the skills. It's extremely complex. It's actually quite overwhelming. And so I cast around to try to find help and guidance and advice from fellow directors and discovered that we were sort of the blind leading the blind. And that's when I set to work, creating the type of support system that selfishly I felt I needed and that I was hoping other directors would reach for, so that in our role as stewards of our companies, we could be much, much more effective and proactive in advocating for the adoption of a Paris-aligned, that is to say 1.5 degree aligned climate transition strategy, and not merely be advocates, because that's not enough, but actually come with some very concrete ideas about how to translate aspiration into reality.
And Karina, I know that in 2019, you co-founded the CGI under the auspices of the World Economic Forum. And just as a reminder, the CGI stands for Climate Governance Initiative, and its mission is to mobilize boards around the world to accelerate the net zero transition. And as you know, Karina, here at NACD, we're very proud to be the US host chapter of the CGI. Can you share with us what successes has the initiative seen since its founding in 2019? And also, how do you measure success and what remains to be done?
Yeah, well, I will start by saying that I think a major success was partnering with the NACD, because obviously what better organization to have as our partners in promoting this. So I would say, look, we are now in over 70 countries. Some of our chapters, we have 30 chapters in 70 countries. So some of our chapters are regional hubs. We have a Southern African hub that covers 16 countries in Southern Africa, just by way of illustration. And then we have the United States, which is a single chapter, and that's more than anyone, that's a big bite to digest as it is. And so I would say, to answer your question about what success is that we are now in all continents. We are in North America, we have Canada, US. We're in South America, we have Mexico, Brazil, Chile. We're in Africa, we are in Egypt, as well as the 16 Southern and Eastern African countries. We're in Eastern and Western Europe. In fact, we started in Western Europe, Italy being the very first one. And we have good coverage in Asia Pacific. So several countries in Asia, as well as Australia, New Zealand. But we still have a lot of work to do. We are not in India. We are not in China. We are not in South Korea. We are not in Japan. We are actively working on getting our first Middle East, well, if you don't count Egypt, our first Gulf country, which is UAE. We're very hopeful we will launch. We didn't launch at COP, but we were very hopeful we will launch soon. And that would be, they wouldn't be our first petrostate, because I consider Canada and the US to be our first petrostates. And of course, we also have a Scandinavian one. So we have Norway. So we have good participation from countries that understand the challenges of disengaging from the fossil fuel industry. But it's still going to be an enormous challenge to get that over the line in countries where, sometimes 60, 70, 80% of fiscal takings depend on the oil and gas sector. And, that's difficult. It's very, very difficult to pull off. We need to give these countries a viable future. So those are the types of issues that we're thinking about. And so depending on the country where you operate, you have a very different set of challenges, even though climate change knows no borders, right? But how we tackle, how we succeed, really depends on where we are.
It's an amazing group, and we feel very privileged to be part of it. And as part of the CGI mission is also to disseminate and raise awareness around the 8 climate governance principles that the WEF came up with. So I wanted to ask you, in your mind, do you think that there is one in particular, one of those 8 principles that stands out to you as most important? And maybe if you can explain why.
Oh, you're asking me to choose my favorite child. That's a very unfair question. Look, I think I'm going to answer this slightly randomly, and it's this. I often found when I raised this issue with fellow directors that the most recalcitrant directors were the ones who said, you are asking me to do something that puts me in direct contravention of my fiduciary obligations, because you are asking me to leave profitable business on the table. And I'm not going to do that, because I'll either get sued or I'll get sacked. But either way, this is not an outcome I'm particularly keen on. So I just want to carry on doing my job the way I've always done it, which is to maximize shareholder returns in the way that I know. And I've got the business judgment rule on my side. And in fact, what we ended up doing is commissioning a series of legal opinions. It started off with, I think it was 27 countries. And then each year we put out an updated version of what we call our legal primer on directors' duties and disclosure obligations regarding climate governance, where we found that in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, be it common law or civil law, Sharia law, Ottoman law, you name it, we found that the existing set of obligations required companies to take into account the factors that were such as to pose a legitimate and material risk to the business. And when you add that kind of basic layout of what directors in every jurisdiction must do with the emerging or now well emerged, widely accepted understanding, which has been reiterated by over 95 central banks around the world, that climate change poses the single greatest risk to global systemic financial stability, you put those two things together, and there is the inescapable conclusion that it is the director's obligation, not an option, an obligation to consider climate change. Now, those principles together fall into what is principle one, which is what I call the sort of the gateway principle, if you like, and the theory of the gateway drug, right? Which is that once you've broken through that particular obstacle, that particular resistance, it's difficult for directors to say, sorry, not my job, because you will not be able to argue in 5 years or 10 years. I didn't know. No one said. Nobody knew. That's simply not true. You could never argue that ever again. Everybody knows. Everybody knew. Everybody knows now. In fact, everybody knew years ago. And so as a director, you have to do this. As directors, we all have to take account of this. Now, is it simple? Certainly not. And the other principles then give you the tools for how to interpret this obligation into specific actions and deliverables.
Yeah, absolutely. And so you just talked about the risks that exist if directors ignore climate issues affecting their companies, right? But what else would you say to board members who feel that climate risk is not within the scope of their oversight responsibilities? What other arguments would you provide?
Well, I besides saying, have a look at this very reader-friendly primer that has a section on your country, most likely, that is, 1 to 2 pages long, very digestible, even for, the most attention span challenged director out there. And I don't mean to be self-deprecating here. There are more and more and more regulations around the world that are compelling companies to disclose what they are doing on climate change. And in some cases, such as the UK, they must disclose what their 1.5 degree aligned transition strategy is, right? The UK government has taken at that level, that step further. Now, if companies are compelled by law to do this, ergo, directors are compelled by law to comply with these rules. They must lead the company. They must shepherd the company through this process. And, they don't need to be atmospheric scientists, but they do need to be thoughtful and use sound judgment and ask searching questions in the boardroom and satisfy themselves that management is giving this the serious consideration that it deserves.
Yep, well said. Now, let me talk a little bit more about your experience. I know you sat on the board of multiple companies, and can you tell us, in particular, what have you done to get your boards more active on the ESG and climate oversight front?
The first thing to do, and I've had varying levels of luck on this one, right? So in one board, which I will not name, it was necessary to start with the basics and get, a very, very high quality expert in to present to us on the basic science and macroeconomics of climate change. And what was supposed to be a 1-hour briefing, because of the fascinated reaction of our members and the bombarding of questions, lasted 2.5 hours. So there was definitely, an appetite, but there was definitely low awareness. And that was really a turning point. So some companies will need that. in other ones of my companies, there was already a very strong openness to the issue. I suspect because, people more and more are hearing this from the media, from their adult kids, their teenage kids, their grandkids. So it's very hard to pretend that it's not happening, but they still lacked the skills for what to do about it. So you can already step to level 2, which is, okay, I know this is important. Now, what are the details of why it's important? And then level 3, so now what do I need to do about it? And if I go straight to level 3, and by the way, this level 3 is not principle 3. I'm just sort of giving you the steps up the ladder, if you like.
Yes, yes.
You want to think in terms of what is the context in which my company is operating? Where do I sit today? So you need to take stock of where the company is in terms of its carbon footprint, which is necessary but not sufficient, but also what its business model is, and if it is compatible over the medium and long term with the world that will be weaning itself off of high carbon products and services. Because, you take the example of my oil and gas company, which I left 7 months ago. We were in an obsolescing business. We had to acknowledge that fact. It's not that it was going to shut up shop, next week by any means. We all accept that, oil and gas is going to be around for a while. We can argue very, shall we say, actively about just how long, but nevertheless, there will be oil and gas for a period of time. And that gives us a runway to organize an orderly transition. But organize an orderly transition, we must. Now, that was a discussion that we needed to focus on. So we needed to see where we were and then see where we needed to get to by 2050. And then a bit like when they built the Channel Tunnel, and you're starting at both ends of the, in the French side and the British side, we have to somehow make these two pieces meet, right? Where are we going to be in 2050? And where are we now? And what are the interim steps to get us from A to Z?
Right. The milestones are really important in that journey.
Absolutely right. And this is, of course, what is often missing from what companies will put out publicly. They'll put out an aspiration, by 2050, we're going to be net zero. Mm-hmm. And then they say, each year we're going to knock off 3 to 5% of our emissions. That doesn't tell you the whole story. And it certainly doesn't tell you how you're going to get to zero in 2050. So it's very, very important that the board have they can be quite, grueling sessions. Very most likely get some outside help. I mean, I know in my companies, we got outside help for this, expert help to work out what this was going to look like, how it was going to work, what the missing pieces of the puzzle were. And then we had to figure out what technologies we already have, which ones we have to develop or acquire, and how we're going to steer our way along this pathway. What I don't accept as a board member, and I see this in too many companies, is they'll say, we will get there, but it'll depend on a whole bunch of unproven technologies that we don't yet know. You can't, that's not a plan, right? No. That's not a plan. So, if that's the best you have as a company, you have a problem. As a director, I feel that you are deficient in your obligation and you have to keep going back to the drawing board until you have a credible answer. So
yeah, I think credible is key here.
Absolutely. Because, your investors have to believe in you, but also your stakeholders, which by the way, include your own staff. And I keep hearing this from colleagues in other companies that their younger staff, their under 30s, are extremely impatient, extremely demanding, and want to see evidence of commitment and evidence of progress. And, I would say in my own companies, that was also very clearly the case. So I do think that a lot of times we have the wind at our back in terms of the willingness of key stakeholders. It's a bit of a mixed picture on the investor side ever since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, because obviously it caused not only a spike in oil prices, but also enormous rush to achieve energy security, which has really muddled the argument tremendously, particularly for the oil and gas industry. We were getting much clearer signals from our investors before the war than after. And then it became incumbent on us to push back to investors and say, listen, we don't have the luxury of flip-flopping, even if you do, right? We are a business where assets have a 30 or 40-year life on them. So when we make a commitment, we stick to it, and we have to stay the course. So, but this is the case whether you're dealing in oil and gas or in automotive or chemicals or aluminum or steel or cement, all of these very difficult industries, we need to make a commitment, and we need to keep progressing, and we need to be serious and transparent.
Absolutely. And coming back to the old company that you recently served on, I know that you were chairing the Sustainability and Scenarios Committee. What was that like?
It was a very interesting committee because prior to my joining the board, and therefore prior also to the current CEO having risen to the role of CEO, he had been in the company for 36 years, but he was promoted to CEO in 2014 when I joined. He rebadged that committee from strategy and sustainability, which I thought was already pretty darned enlightened, to sustainability and scenarios, which really put scenarios at the heart of how we drive sustainability. And I guess that strategy was implicit in there. And in any case, there's generally the view that the strategy is owned by the whole board rather than any one committee. And at least that was his strongly held view. And I don't disagree. So what that meant, and it took us a little bit of time, I have to say, it took us a little bit of time to get our head around this, where the exercise of scenario building is a well-practiced one in commodities-driven companies, because you have to. And in my company, every 3 months, at a minimum, we would refresh our scenarios. And then if something major happens, such as, a war breaking out, we would have an emergency session to look at how it might affect our scenarios, which of course in this instance it radically did. And so what that meant is that whereas traditionally we had looked at all of the commodities that you would expect, various grades of oil, gas, coal, even though we were not a coal company, we looked at coal because, of course, it was intimately related to the demand for our products, various chemical components that we sold through our chemicals company, currencies, interest rates, and inflation. Now, what we then added was CO2. And up until that point, our scenarios were based on what we thought was most likely to happen, which I personally objected to, because I thought the purpose of scenarios is also to stress test those extremes, those they're black swan events. We really need to look at what you may think is unlikely to happen, but what, for example, the UNFCCC and the International Energy Agency, IEA, both say must happen, which is a 1.5 degree pathway. Have we stress tested against that scenario? And that, at first, we were not doing because we did not have the data. And after a few years, we did, because we did get the data, and it did become a routine part of how we looked at the business. And I think that's fundamental. And I would urge every board to do that. So, you could look at what you think is likely to happen, your base case. And sadly today, we do not believe that the world is moving in line with a 1.5 degree scenario, and therefore we use a base case that unfortunately is incompatible with 1.5 degrees. But we nevertheless stress test everything against that 1.5 degree scenario in order to see to it that we can be resilient at the drop of a hat and run the business that way. And we also use the second best scenario, which is the one that is 2 degrees, as the basis for our planning, where prior to that we had used a less aggressive, if you like, scenario.
Mm-hmm.
And previously, the scenarios we were using were considerably less aggressive, and so allowed for far more investment in oil and gas and indeed coal, even though we are not in that business. And I would speculate that many, many other oil and gas companies continue to use these less aggressive scenarios, and that is what justifies the investments that they undertake. So we as a company, I should say they, because I'm no longer there, have really tightened up the business tremendously to see to it that it is, first of all, absolutely aligned with 2 degrees, but also easily adaptable to 1.5 degrees the moment the warning signs emerge that the world is going to move in that direction.
Yeah, that's really powerful. I also know that the company that you served on committed to decarbonizing mobility and net zero emissions. Can you talk to us a little bit about the upsides of pivoting to a completely new business strategy like this?
Sure. Well, the first thing to say, by way of context, is that the company committed to net zero emissions scopes 1, 2, and 3.
And 3. Okay. That's important to mention.
Very important. I don't know of a single other oil major, or indeed other oil company, with the exception of Ørsted, which ceased to be an oil company, that has done that. Okay. And therefore, the only way that it can do it is to accept the inevitability of reducing production, right? And it has said so, and it is planning for exactly that kind of pathway. So, and just to complete that picture, so it'll be net zero scope 3 for the entire business by, scopes 1, 2, and 3 by 2050. It'll be net zero scopes 1 and 2 for the upstream business by 2030. Again, I don't know of any other business that is pledging to do that. What you heard at COP was they would be net zero scopes 1 and 2 by 2050. Eni will be there in 2030. And then for the entirety of the business, scope 1 and 2 by 2035. All right. So the refining, the electricity will be scopes 1, 2, and 3 by 2040. So it has an electricity generation business that will be completely out of unabated thermal. There'll be a little bit of thermal left, but it'll be abated with CCS, and most of it will be clean energy. So that's by way of context for the bulk of, the core business. It is then growing a sustainable mobility business, which I have to say took off significantly after I left. So I'm not as knowledgeable, at least I don't have the inside knowledge that I used to, but it was already moving very heavily in that direction when I was there by investing significantly in biofuels. And I'm going to have to qualify that because, of course, biofuels has some very significant concerns associated with them. But it announced back to 2014, because these things never happen overnight, that it was going to convert all of its petroleum refineries to biorefineries. And subsequently, it committed that it was going to phase out the use of palm oil by, I think it was 22, which it did, right, to the dismay of palm oil exporters, and has substituted with fuels that are kind to the environment and kind to the climate. And this is absolutely crucial, because if you're going to produce biofuels by using fuels that damage the rainforest or that compete with food because you're using high quality arable land that would otherwise be used for food, you're solving one problem and creating another. So the company bought a seed company and proceeded to invest in seed development, I should say, not genetically modified, but through hybridization, to develop oil seeds that could grow in degraded, salty, and polluted land. And so this meant that the company is now in partnership with a variety of agricultural cooperatives in 7 or 8 countries in North and Central Africa, producing oil seeds on land that is otherwise not usable for human consumption, or is completely denuded, completely deforested, completely dried out and saline. And so it is growing a variety of these seeds. It is also using, to the extent it could possibly get its hands on it, but of course there's never enough supply, used cooking oil, used animal fats, any number of basically food and agriculture waste that can be used to be reprocessed into biofuels.
I'm going to be shifting gears here, and I want to address the political context. So over the past year, we all witnessed a wave of anti-ESG sentiment. How seriously you think companies should take this movement? And how do you think they should the company and the boards respond to it? And ultimately, should they modify their ESG oversight practices and initiatives as a result of what we're seeing and hearing?
I'm so glad you asked that question. So obviously the answer to your last question is absolutely not. Politics are fickle, and boards can't afford to be dictated to by the fickleness of politicians. So we have to run the business or oversee the business on the basis of what's right for the business. These risks are business risks. Full stop. There's no debating this. And particularly if you operate in a business with very long business cycles like, heavy industry, you just don't have the luxury of, flip-flopping. You have to have a vision and you have to stick to it. Now, does it affect us? Yes, it does. Why? Because our investors, who previously were speaking with increasing authority and also unity on these questions. And when I say unity, there were groups of investors who were coming together and giving us a coherent message about what they were expecting of us. They have fragmented because they themselves are being attacked. And that's not good for them, and it's not good for us, because it means that it's a bit like when you listen to the radio and you have a lot of static, right? You have to try to discern what the message is, and it can be confusing. And so you have to have really strong leadership on the board to push on with what you think is right. And I'm pleased to say in my previous company, that is exactly what we did. But it is disconcerting. And we did have, investor presentations, be they on strategy or the smaller, one-on-one meetings on remuneration, where we would talk about the key performance indicators and how they were tied to the climate transition strategy. And suddenly they would change their tune. And we would have to say, well, sorry, we're not going to change the KPIs just because, right? The KPIs are aligned with the strategy. Yeah. But in the strategy meeting, we had to say, look, energy security is vital, especially in wartime. Affordability is vital, especially when there's a huge supply squeeze. But climate security is vital, and the problem has not gone away. And so we really have this trifecta that we must continue to advance. And, if we'd been having this conversation 40 years ago, we might be able to have put a pause for a couple of years while we wait for the war to pass. but we don't have luxury now.
It's not just about the KPIs, because even if KPIs are not modified, what we've seen companies do is that they are toning down their communication.
Yes.
And it's the whole greenwashing effect,
Yep.
right?
Yep. I've definitely seen that. I don't like it. It's unfortunate. I much prefer that we have the courage of our convictions. I think, as long as the substance does not change, I am prepared to live with a small degree of it. But where I draw the line is when it starts to cut into the substance of what we do. Because I think one of the great beauty of being transparent and accountable is that it forces you to constantly be ambitious. And if you engage in greenwashing, you create space to become lazy. So greenwashing can be dangerous. So a little bit of greenwashing while we wait for the storm to pass, okay, but absolutely the objectives have to be there, and we have to find a way to be true to what we said we would do, which is why I think the transition pathway initiative in the UK is so important. I mean, certainly the UK, even though it's no longer as relevant as it used to be, is trying to achieve relevance on this particular issue on a global scale. They're trying to make this a model that other countries will emulate. And in this respect, I think the UK is virtuous. We, being forced by the regulator to be transparent about our 1.5 degree aligned transition strategy is a very, very healthy discipline.
Yeah, I think that accountability is paramount in it.
Mm-hmm.
So we cannot finish this conversation, Karina, without talking about COP28. So
Yes.
Last week in Dubai, a landmark agreement was approved, and for the first time ever, there was a call for a global transition away from fossil fuels. What's your thinking about that? Some people thought it was not ambitious enough. Some people were happy where we landed. And also, importantly, how do you think this may impact the role of a board director in the next few years?
Well, I'm going to answer the last one first, because I saw a very, very real one, which is that, some of the agreements that were reached around methane and flaring, for example, which are very, very specific to the oil and gas industry, that gave me what I needed to go into one of my boards and say, we have to do this. It's been agreed at COP. We don't have a choice. Okay? It was that simple. It was very simple. It happened to be something that Eni had long ago pledged to do. But for smaller companies that are not there yet, this was just what I was looking for. But on the larger question of the transitioning away from fossil fuels, this is how I see it. It got a lot of criticism for not going far enough, and that criticism is justified because the scale of the challenge that still awaits us is enormous, and this really only starts to take a bite out of it. However, given the very low expectations we went into this COP with, and given what I personally know it's like to move within the oil and gas bubble, and therefore given that the very people who live within this oil and gas bubble were the ones who were running COP, this result was nothing short of a miracle. And I don't normally lavish praise on Sultan al-Jaber easily, but his having persuaded Saudi Arabia to back this is a small miracle, right? So I think it really is a significant step. It's riddled with loopholes. There is the possibility that people will, get away with not doing even what is contained in it because of those loopholes. And therefore, it behooves us, particularly in the boardroom, but also policymakers at national level, to introduce enabling legislation in their countries and regulations and so forth to see to it that the spirit of that agreement is advanced. right? Even though there will be people who will try to punch holes through it. So, yeah, it was to have the words transition away from fossil fuels, 5 magic words, that was a big deal.
Yeah, I agree. So, Karina, let me be a bit controversial here. Are companies really helping address the climate crisis, or are they making it worse?
Do you know, I'm going to answer it this way. I think there's a big mass in the middle who are not doing enough to make a dent, right? And unfortunately, doing nothing makes the problem worse. So yes, and I don't think it's because they're malign. I just think it's because this is just a very, very difficult thing to do, and companies find it difficult, and they don't know where to begin. So there's that block.
Yeah.
Then you have the block of really enlightened leaders who are doing a great job and trying to pull everyone with them. And they deserve immense respect and gratitude for what they're doing, because they're doing God's work. And then there are those who I think are really contributing to making the situation worse. And why do I say that? Because there are companies there who are spinning falsely reassuring tales about what they are doing and how we can get through this without doing the hard work. And that is extremely dangerous because it lulls people into a false sense of security. And we waste precious time when that happens. We also waste precious capital on technologies that are not optimal when we really need to be directing, scarce capital to their highest and best use. So, first and foremost, we have to accept, and this was at the heart of the debate of this COP, as anyone who followed the COP will have seen, and there were some sparks that flew over this. Do we or do we not need to wean ourselves off fossil fuels? The unambiguous answer is yes. And there are still people who believe that the answer is not necessarily. If we do this and if we do that, and if we use carbon capture and storage, and if we use direct air capture and all of these, fancy technologies, look, those technologies have a place. We need them. There is no question, right? We cannot continue to produce cement and glass and steel and there are any number of chemicals and aviation, right, without carbon capture and storage. But it is a stopgap measure. It is not the solution that is going to enable the prolonged existence or much less growth of the fossil fuel industry. And this is the fallacy that is promoted. When you hear the phrase, it's not the oil we have to cut, it's the emissions, be suspicious. Because that is the disingenuous narrative that is creating this false sense of security, and that is dangerous. So companies that engage in this are pulling us in the opposite direction of progress, and we simply can't afford that. We need these companies who have fantastic technologies, fantastically skilled people, deep pockets, to all pull together in developing the technologies that will get us over this hump. But it does come with the acceptance. It's a bit like, when you recognize you're an alcoholic, you've got to recognize where the problem lies, right? You can't pretend that it's not there, and then we can fix it.
Yeah. Thank you for being so candid, Karina. Well, thank you, Karina. I always love talking to you. Your passion for the topic is contagious and your experience unmatched. So lovely to have you.
Thank you, Rita. It's always a pleasure to work with you. And thank you for having me participate in this very interesting discussion.
That concludes this episode of BoardVision. We hope you enjoyed listening. Please subscribe and join us next time. Until then, visit nacdonline.org to stay informed about the latest resources NACD has to offer, such as memberships, certification, national or chapter events, and our content, including reports, articles, and Directorship magazine. That's nacdonline.org. Thank you for listening.